He kissed her on the cheek that morning, like he always did, quick, distracted, smelling like someone else's perfume. Amara Ravello said nothing. She touched her swollen belly and watched her husband walk out the front door. And for the first time in 7 months of carrying his child, she made a decision she should have made long ago. She was done. Not with screaming, not with confrontation, not with begging a man who had already chosen someone else while she grew his son inside her body. Done in a way that would cost Dante Ravello something no gun, no threat, and no amount of money could ever get back. By midnight, she was gone, and Dante didn't even know the ground had already been pulled from beneath his feet. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like you were nothing while you were quietly holding everything together, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what Amara did next is something nobody saw coming, not even the most feared mafia boss in Chicago. And if this kind of story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. The storm came in fast off the lake, the way Chicago storms always do, without apology, without warning. Just sudden darkness, and the sound of the wind tearing through the trees along the waterfront like it had a grievance to settle. Dante Ravello drove home through it at midnight, one hand loose on the wheel. His mind's already somewhere far away from the rain, hammering the windshield of his black Escalade. He wasn't thinking about the storm. He wasn't thinking about the storm. He wasn't thinking about his wife sleeping upstairs, 7 months pregnant, her body curved around the pillow he'd stopped reaching for weeks ago. He was thinking about nothing important, the way a man thinks when he believes his life is completely under control. That was always Dante's first mistake, believing he was in control. He was 37 years old, and he had built something most men in his world only dreamed about. The Ravello name didn't just open doors in Chicago. It closed them. It cleared rooms. It made police commissioners pause before they picked up the phone. He ran 3 casinos, 4 luxury nightclubs, a trucking network that moved more than cargo across 6 states, and an underground financial operation that had made him wealthier than men, with twice his experience and 3 times his age. Men who had started in this life before Dante was born still watched how they spoke around him. He had everything a man in his position was supposed to want. He pulled through the iron gates of his lakefront estate, and the security light swept across the front of the house, and something felt wrong before he could name what it was. He sat in the driveway for a moment, engine idling, studying the darkened windows. The mansion was always dark when he came home late. Amara went to bed early. That wasn't unusual, but the house felt empty in a way he couldn't explain. Not quiet. Empty. He told himself he was tired. He went inside. The kitchen was clean. Too clean. The kind of clean where nothing has been touched, not the kind of clean where someone tied it up before bed. Her prenatal vitamins weren't on the counter beside the refrigerator, where she kept them every single night without fail. A habit so consistent that Dante had stopped noticing the little amber bottle the same way you stop noticing sinks in a picture on a wall. He noticed now. He climbed the stairs slowly, and the feeling in his chest tightened with every step in a way he didn't have a word for yet. He pushed open the bedroom door. Her side of the bed hadn't been slept in. Not disturbed, not rumpled, just made smooth. The decorative pillows still in their places, which Amara always removed before getting in, every single night, stacking them on the chair in the corner. Pillows were still on the bed. Dante stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds without moving. Then he opened her closet. The hangers were there, many of them, but the dresses were gone. Her everyday clothes were gone. The soft maternity things she'd bought over the last few months, the loose blouses and comfortable pants that she wore around the house, all of it gone. Not ransacked, not thrown around like there'd been a struggle, just removed, deliberately, like someone had packed with a clear head and a list. He went to the nursery. The crib was still there. The rocking chair was still there. The mobile he'd had shipped from Italy, the one with the tiny painted stars that played a melody Amara had chosen herself, that was still there. But the handmade blankets her grandmother had sent from her family in Lagos Gone, the tiny folded onesies and the little knit hats she'd organized into stacks by size Gone. The photograph she'd placed on the dresser, the one of her mother holding a baby that Dante had always assumed was Amara herself Gone. She hadn't taken the baby furniture. She'd taken the love she'd put into that room. Dante walked back to his own bedroom, moved to his desk, and stopped. Her sweating ring sat in the center of the desk, not in the dish by the bathroom sink where she usually left it when she showered, not on the nightstand, on his desk, placed deliberately where he would see it the moment he turned on the light. A 5-carat solitaire set in platinum that had cost more than most people's houses, sitting alone on the dark wood like a period at the end of a sentence. Around it, undisturbed, were the other things she'd left behind. The diamond tennis bracelet from their 3rd anniversary, pearl earrings he'd brought her from Japan, 2 envelopes of cash he'd left for her last month household money. He'd said, though, in truth, it was the thing men like Dante did when they felt guilty and couldn't say so. Both envelopes, still sitting where he'd left them. She had taken nothing he gave her. She had only taken things that were already hers. Dante sat down heavily in the desk chair and stared at that ring for a long time. He told himself she would be back. He told himself she'd gone to her friend Celestine's place across the city, or maybe to the hotel on Michigan Avenue, where she sometimes treated herself to a night when she needed space and didn't want to ask him for it. He told himself she was emotional, that pregnant women got emotional, that she'd be on the phone by morning. He told himself a lot of things in that chair, and underneath every single one of them, something cold was spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Victor Salerno arrived at the mansion at 2 in the morning. Victor was 61 years old, built like a retired boxer, who'd replaced his muscle with patience, and he had been Dante's consigliere for 11 years. He had seen Dante angry. He had seen him cold. He had seen him sit across a table from men who were going to die and not so much as blink. But when Victor walked into the study that night and saw Dante sitting at his desk, staring at nothing, with Amara's wedding ring in his palm, he felt something he hadn't felt in years around this man. Concern. She left, Dante said without looking up. Victor set a leather portfolio on the desk and didn't sit down. I know. That's not the only reason I'm here. Dante finally looked at him. What? Victor opened the portfolio. He placed several documents on the desk in a careful row, the way you arrange things when you want someone to have time to absorb what they're looking at before you start talking. Incorporation papers, property transfer records, old wire transfer logs from what appeared to be a Sicilian financial network, and a name that kept appearing across the oldest documents, a name Dante had never looked at closely because he'd never had a reason to. Valenti. When you were building the organization, Victor said carefully, back when you were still a soldier putting together your first real operation, you needed capital. You remember, I remember. You were told the backing came from the Licari network out of Palermo. Victor was quiet for a moment. It didn't. Dante looked up from the documents. The money was filtered through a Palermo account, Victor said, but it originated from a private holding company, registered in Delaware, a company created by a trust established by Emanuele Valenti in 1987, administered after his death by his sole surviving granddaughter. Victor paused. Dante, the money that financed your early expansion came from Amara, from her grandfather's business empire. She was the silent investor you never knew you had. The room felt like it got smaller. Dante picked up one of the documents. He looked at the dates. He looked at the transfer amounts. He looked at the corporate name that appeared again and again in the fine print of documents he'd signed years ago, without reading closely enough, because the money had been there, and he'd been young and certain of himself, and hadn't bothered to follow every thread back to its source. Valenti Holdings, LLC, her grandfather's name. How much? Dante asked. His voice was very quiet. The initial capital? Around 4 million. But that's not the number that matters. Victor put his finger on a different page. The warehousing contracts, the transportation licenses, the commercial real estate that you've been using for legitimate fronts for the last 8 years. Dante, those properties, the majority of them, they are owned by companies that Amara legally controls, or that she transferred into her name, quietly, over the last 6 months. 6 months. The same 6 months he'd been spending 3 nights a week in an apartment on the near north side with Bianca Moretti. Dante set the document down on the desk. He pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. She knew, he said. She knew about Bianca, Victor said. I don't know how long. But yes. And Victor stopped himself, chose a word. Occupied. She was working. The call came in at 3:47 in the morning from a patrol officer who owed Dante a favor he'd never had to collect until tonight. Amara's SUV had been found at the riverfront parking lot near the Clark Street Bridge, parked with the engine off. Her phone was on the passenger seat. Her purse was on the floor. The driver's door was unlocked. There was a paper coffee cup in the cup holder, still faintly warm when the officer arrived. The door had been left open. Dante stood in that parking lot in the rain at 4 in the morning and looked at his wife's car and tried to make himself think clearly. And for the first time in a very long career of making cold decisions in difficult moments, he could not. His head kept doing the math on the wrong things. The phone was inside, so she hadn't called anyone before leaving the car. Purse was inside, so she hadn't been grabbed in a way that gave her time to take anything. Coffee was still warm, so whatever happened hadn't been long ago. The door was left open. His hands were shaking. Dante Ravello's hands didn't shake. That was not something that happened. Men had watched him pour whiskey into a glass 30 minutes after ordering someone's death and not spill a drop. He had testified before a grand jury 3 times and never broken a sweat. He had buried his father, his uncle, 2 of his closest captains, and a friend from childhood, all before the age of 35, and he had done it with the controlled grief of a man who understood that showing too much feeling was a kind of weakness he couldn't afford. Standing in the rain beside his pregnant wife's abandoned car, his hands were shaking, and he couldn't make them stop. He called in every favor he had before sunrise. By 6 in the morning, every Ravello driver, every street contact, every nightclub manager and warehouse foreman and off-book informant in Chicago had the same instruction: find her. Find Amara Ravello, 7 months pregnant, 5'6", and do not stop looking until she's found. No question was too small, no lead was too minor, nothing came back. The city that had never hidden anything from Dante Ravello had apparently agreed to keep this one secret. 2 days passed. During those 2 days, Dante did not sleep. He barely ate. Victor sat across from him in the study, going over documents and logistics, while the rest of the organization quietly absorbed the news that something was wrong. Not with a rival, not with law enforcement, but with Dante himself, which was somehow more unsettling to everyone who worked for him than any external threat could have been. On the second day, Bianca showed up. She arrived at the front door with 2 suitcases and the particular kind of confidence that belongs to a woman who has been told she is the most important person in someone's life for long enough that she's started to believe it has legal standing. Dante looked at her in the doorway for a moment. He was unshaved, which he never was. His shirt was wrinkled. There were shadows under his eyes that no amount of money could fix. And Bianca looked at all of this, at the clear signs that something had gone seriously wrong, and her expression shifted in a way that told him everything he needed to know about what she'd actually been after all along. "You look terrible," she said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. "What's happening with her businesses?" "My friend said she heard the Ravello warehouses are." "Go home, Bianca." "Dantes, I'm trying to understand what this means for—" "Go home." She left, and Dante stood in the empty foyer of the mansion that Amara had decorated and managed and quietly sustained while he was busy building his reputation, and he understood something he didn't want to understand, about the distinction between a woman who loved him and a woman who loved what being with him represented. Bianca had wanted the king. Amara had been there before the kingdom existed. His private phone rang at 11 that night, a number he didn't recognize. He answered because every call was worth answering now. Dante. He sat down hard on the edge of the desk. It was her voice. It was unmistakably her voice, and she sounded calm, which somehow was more alarming than anything else, because Amara was calm the way a woman is calm when she has already done the hardest thing and is past the point of uncertainty. Amara. He kept his voice even through something that cost him more than he expected. "Where are you? Are you safe? Is the baby—" "We're both fine. He's healthy. I'm healthy. And no, I'm not going to tell you where we are." He breathed. "Amara." Her voice didn't rise. That was the thing about Amara. She never needed to raise her voice to make you feel the full weight of what she meant. "Don't apologize yet. I'm not calling for an apology. I'm calling because there's something you need to do, and if you do it, I'll restore the business contracts your organization is about to lose. If you don't, She paused. Then you can find out what happens when everything you built loses the foundation it's been standing on. Dante was quiet. I know about the apartment, she said. I know about the trip to Miami in March that you told me was business in Detroit. I know about the bracelet you bought her in April, the gold one, because your assistant used the Ravello account and didn't think I looked at those statements. Another pause, shorter this time. I know about the conversation you had with Sal at the restaurant on Western Avenue last February, where you told him that your wife would never leave because she had nowhere else to go. Closed his eyes. You thought I was trapped, she said. You thought devotion and dependence were the same thing. They're not. They were never the same thing. And I need you to understand that before I tell you what I'm asking you to do. What do you want, Amara? A meeting, she said. Your captains, your allied families, everyone who matters to the Ravello organization. I want you to stand in front of all of them and tell them the truth about where the money came from, about what I built, about what you did. The line was silent for a moment. You want me to stop? Yes. Amara, you understand what you're asking? I understand exactly what I'm asking, she said. The question is whether you do. The line went dead. Dante sat holding the phone in the dark for a long time. Outside, the Chicago night was still and cold. Somewhere across the city, his wife was sitting with their unborn son, calm and certain in a way he had never once appreciated when she was sitting beside him every morning at the kitchen table. He had built an empire, and he had never once stopped to wonder who had helped him hold it up. He was beginning to understand now. Dante didn't sleep that night. He sat in the same chair, in the same study, with the same documents spread across the desk that Victor had laid out 2 days ago, and he read through every one of them again, slower this time. He had the kind of focus that only comes from the complete absence of sleep and the presence of something that feels like the floor dropping out from under a building you thought you owned. He read the transfer records. He traced the corporate structure of Valenti Holdings backward through its subsidiaries, through the Delaware registration, through the Palermo routing account, all the way back to the original capital injection that had arrived in his organization's accounts 14 years ago, when he was 23 years old and hungry, and so certain of his own intelligence that he hadn't looked closely enough at where the money was actually coming from. $4 million. $4 million from a dead man's trust, administered by a 22-year-old woman who had never once mentioned it to him. Not when they were dating, not when they got married. Not in 8 years of marriage, not once. Not a single reference to the fact that the ground his empire stood on had been purchased with her inheritance. He thought about every conversation they'd ever had about money, business, about the organization. He thought about the times Amara had asked questions that he'd brushed off as curiosity, or answered with the kind of vague half-truth that men in his world used reflexively with everyone, including their wives. He thought about the look on her face during those conversations, patient, attentive, never pressings. And he understood now that she hadn't been merely curious. She'd been auditing him. For years. The thought should have made him angry. Part of him reached for the anger, because anger was familiar and controllable, and he knew exactly what to do with it. But underneath the reach, something else was there. Something closer to the feeling of stepping onto ice and hearing it crack before your full weight has even landed. He was still sitting there when the first call came in at 6:30 in the morning. It was Marco Ferrante, who ran the Ravello distribution network out of the Southside warehouse complex. Marco was not a man who panicked. He had been in this organization for 16 years and had never once called before 8 in the morning for anything short of a crisis. The Halstead warehouse, Marco said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man trying to sound calm and not quite making it. The property management company sent a notice last night. Change of ownership filing. Dante. The company that owns that building isn't ours anymore. Transfer was filed 3 weeks ago. Dante was quiet. Which company? He asked. Marco read the name off the document. It was a Valenti subsidiary. Dante hung up without responding, which Marco would have understood was not a good sign. The second call came 11 minutes later from Paulie Ricci, who managed the trucking contracts out of the Northwest Terminal. Same story. A financing agreement that backed 3 of their most profitable transportation licenses had been restructured through a holding company that Paulie had never had reason to look at closely before. The holding company's parent entity had changed its registered agent. The new agent was a law firm in Washington, D.C. that Dante had never heard of. The third call came from Victor, who had apparently been awake all night also. How many? Dante asked before Victor could speak. I've counted 9 properties so far, Victor said. 7 commercial, 2 industrial, plus 4 financing agreements, and what looks like the majority interest in the transportation licensing consortium that covers our Chicago to Detroit corridor. A pause. She was methodical, Dante. This wasn't done in a rush. The earliest transfer I can find was filed 8 months ago. 8 months ago. Before she was pregnant, before she knew, or maybe right around when she first suspected. Dante tried to work the timeline and kept arriving. At the same terrible conclusion, Amara had started protecting herself before he'd even fully committed to the betrayal, as if some part of her had felt it coming, the way animals feel weather changing before any instrument can measure it. What's the exposure? He asked. If she pulls the contracts entirely, we lose warehouse capacity that handles about 40% of our legitimate freight volume. The transportation licenses alone, Dante, we would have to renegotiate from scratch with carriers who know we're in a weakened position. The revenue hit in the first 6 months would be, Victor stopped. He never stopped mid-sentence. It would be significant. How significant? The kind of significant that makes people start asking whether the Ravello organization is still the right organization to be affiliated with. Study felt very quiet after that. Dante set the phone down on the desk and looked at the wall. He had spent his entire adult life making sure that question never got asked. By noon, word had traveled. Not through any announcement, not through anything Dante or Victor had said. It traveled the way bad news travels in that world through silences, through the particular way certain phone calls didn't get returned as quickly as usual, through a lunch meeting that was postponed, without explanation, by the representative of a Pittsburgh family that Dante had been doing business with for 6 years. Sal Marchetti showed up at the mansion at 2 in the afternoon without being called. Sal was 54, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had always been plain and had made its peace with it decades ago. He ran the Ravello casino operations and had been one of Dante's most loyal lieutenants since the beginning. He was also, Dante knew, the captain who had been present at the restaurant on Western Avenue last February, when Dante had said what he'd said about Amara. Sal sat down across from Dante in the study and put his hands flat on the desk, not in a threatening way, more the way a man does when he wants you to understand he's there and paying attention. Talk to me, Sal said. There's nothing to talk about. Dante. Sal's voice was tired. Tired in the way of a man who has watched something he cared about start to come apart at the edges and knows he doesn't have enough hands to hold it together. I've been getting calls since 10 o'clock this morning. Caruso's people. The Brennan crew. That lawyer we use for the licensing board contacts. Everyone wants to know the same thing, which is whether you're still running this organization or whether the organization is running itself. Dante looked at him. Because here's what it looks like from the outside right now, Sal continued. Your wife is missing. She's not missing. She left. Sal absorbed that. Okay, your wife left. While pregnant. And apparently took significant legal and financial infrastructure with her when she went. Infrastructure that nobody in this organization, including me, and I'm not happy about that was attached to her in the first place. And now you're sitting in this study, not sleeping and not eating and not giving anyone any direction. He leaned forward slightly. That's what it looks like from the outside. I'm aware of what it looks like. Are you aware that Tommy Caruso had dinner with the Delfino brothers last night? In public, without telling you. Sal waited. 2 years ago, Tommy Caruso wouldn't walk across the street to get a sandwich without making sure you knew about it first. Dante was quiet for a moment. Who told you about the dinner? The bartender at the restaurant owed me one. Did the Delfinos approach Tommy, or did Tommy approach them? Tommy made the reservation. That landed differently than the property transfer notices. Property was money. Tommy Caruso moving toward the Delfino family was something else entirely. It was the first visible crack in the structure of loyalty that Dante's entire operation depended on. How long ago did he make the reservation? Dante asked. 4 days. 4 days ago, Amara was still missing, and her car was sitting at the riverfront, and Dante had been standing in the rain shaking. And Tommy Caruso had already been on the phone making dinner reservations. He was watching, Dante said. They're all watching, Sal said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Dante called a meeting for that evening. Not a full sit-down, not the kind that required protocol and formal notification. Just his inner circle. The 6 men who had been with him long enough to know where everything was buried, literally and otherwise. Victor, Sal Marco, Paulie. A man named Eddie Corso who handled the financial side of the casino network. And Ren Taggart, who was 32 years old and had come up fast in the organization over the last 3 years, and who Dante had been quietly grooming as a future captain without saying so explicitly. They gathered in the study at 7 o'clock. Dante stood at the window, with his back to the room for a moment, before he turned around, and when he did, he looked at each of them in turn. He was looking for something specific in their faces. He was reading them, the way he'd been reading rooms full of dangerous men for 15 years. Not for what they said, but for what they were careful not to show. Eddie Corso's expression was professional and blank in a way that was slightly too deliberate. Ren Taggart looked alert and attentive, which was normal for Ren, except that his attention seemed to be focused on what everyone else in the room was doing rather than on Dante, which was not normal. Marco looked tired and genuinely worried, which Dante read as loyalty. Sal looked the way Sal always looked, like a man, bracing to hear something he already knew was coming. Paula Frici was sweating. It was winter. The study was not warm. Paulie was sweating. "I'm going to say something once," Dante said. "And I'm going to need every person in this room to listen carefully, because I'm not going to repeat it, and I'm not going to explain it more than once." He moved to the desk and stood behind it, not sitting. "The situation with the Valenti properties and contracts is real. Amara controls them legally. That is a fact that we are going to work around, and we will work around it. The Halstead warehouse, the Northwest terminal financing, the transportation licenses, all of it is manageable. It is not fatal. Anyone who is telling people outside this room that it is fatal is wrong, and I would very much like to know who those people are." He let that sit. Paulie's jaw moved slightly. Just slightly. "The Caruso situation," Dante continued, "is a misunderstanding that Tommy and I are going to resolve. Directly. Tomorrow morning." He looked at Sal. "Set up the meeting." Sal nodded. "Any questions?" Eddie Corso shifted in his chair. "The Pittsburgh people. I'll handle Pittsburgh. There's also the matter of the Delfino offer," Eddie said. The room went still. Dante looked at Eddie. "What offer?" Eddie glanced at Victor, then back at Dante. "A licensing arrangement. For the corridor routes. They reached out to our freight manager this morning. Apparently they have a proposal that would cover the gap in the transportation contracts if Amara's entities pull the backing." Dante's voice was very even. "When did our freight manager receive this proposal?" "This morning." "And when did you hear about it?" A pause. "A small one, but it was there this afternoon." "And you're telling me now?" "At 7 in the evening." "I thought it was important to wait until we were all together." Dante looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that lesser men described afterward as feeling like being held underwater. "The Delfino family," Dante said carefully, "contacted our freight manager directly, without going through me, and you received that information several hours ago and chose not to call me immediately." He paused. "I want you to think very carefully about whether what you just told me is the complete version of events." Eddie's expression didn't change. "It's complete." "Good," Dante said. "Then we'll revisit it." He ended the meeting shortly after, and as the men filed out, Victor stayed behind. He always stayed behind. "Eddie," Dante said when the door closed. "I know," Victor said. "How long?" "I don't know yet." "Find out." "Yes." Victor gathered the documents from the desk. Then he paused with his hands still on the papers. "Dante, the meeting she's asking for. The one with the captains and the allied families." He kept his voice flat, informational, the way Victor delivered things he knew were going to land hard. "I want you to consider it. Victor, I'm not saying what she's asking for is small. I know exactly what it would cost you to stand in front of those men and say what she wants you to say. I understand what that means in your world. In our world." He looked up. "But I want you to think about what happens if you don't. Not to your reputation. To the actual structure of this organization. Without those contracts, without the legitimate infrastructure she controls, Dante, we are exposed in ways that no amount of street muscle addresses. Money laundering, transport real estate, the fronts that keep law enforcement's eyes off the operation. She didn't just take furniture when she left. She took the walls." Dante was quiet. "I'm not telling you what to decide," Victor said. I've never done that. I'm telling you to decide without pride. Because pride is the thing that has already cost you the most. He left. Dante sat alone in the study with the walls. Victor had just described already feeling thinner around him. He drove to Bianca's building at 9 o'clock that night. He wasn't sure why. He told himself it was because he needed to end things clearly and completely, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Some part of him that he didn't fully want to examine needed to stand in front of the persons who had been at the center of all of this and feel something. Confirmation of a mistake. Proof that it had been real. He wasn't sure. She buzzed him up without asking who it was. The apartment was the one he'd rented for her, on the 23rd floor, with the city view she'd said she loved, in a building that had cost him more per month than most people, made in a year, and he noticed as he walked through the door that the view from the window now looked to him like exactly what it was. A very expensive way of showing someone that you valued their company without actually valuing who they were. Bianca was in the kitchen. She'd been cooking. She turned when he came in, and the expression on her face cycled through several things in rapid succession relief. Then something guarded, then a performance of warmth that she hadn't quite had time to fully construct. "You look better than yesterday," she said. "I'm not staying," Dante said. Her expression settled. "Dante, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Not a diplomatic version. The truth." She put down the spoon she was holding.
Okay.
"Did anyone ever approach you, anyone at all, and ask you questions about my marriage? About Amara? About the state of things between us?" She was still. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind I'm asking once." "No one approached me," she said. "Dante, why would someone? Did anyone ever encourage you? Push you toward something? Make it easier for things to happen in between us in ways that, looking back, might seem a little too convenient?" The stillness in her face changed quality. It became something more careful. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Dante said slowly, "that I'm starting to think that some of what happened between us didn't happen purely by accident. I'm saying that there are people in my organization who benefit from me being distracted and from my marriage being destabilized. And I'm asking you directly whether anyone was ever in contact with you in ways that would be relevant to that." Bianca picked up the spoon again, put it back down. A small restless movement that told him her hands needed something to do. "There was a man," she said finally. "He called himself a business associate of yours. He called me about 8 months ago. Said he was putting together an event, some kind of fundraiser, and wanted to know if I'd be interested in attending. I thought it was just networking. His name. He said his name was Enzo." Dante's expression didn't move. "And did Enzo happen to mention my name at any point during this networking conversation?" She didn't answer. "Bianca." "He said you would be at the event," she said quietly. "And you were. And we talked. And I thought it was just how those things happen." Dante looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the apartment around her, the city view behind her, the entire carefully constructed setting that he now understood had been arranged for him as deliberately as a stage set. "There was no fundraiser," he said. "I figured that out," she said. She didn't look away. To her credit, she didn't look away. Not right away, but eventually. "And by then, she stopped. By then you'd made a calculation," Dante said. There was no heat in it, just fact. "People make calculations, Dante. You of all people should understand that." "Yes," he said, "I do understand that." He left the apartment without saying anything else, and in the elevator going down, he stood with his eyes closed and worked through the timeline. 8 months ago. Enzo, whoever that was, whatever name they'd actually used, had introduced Dante to Bianca at an arranged event 8 months ago, around the same time that Amara had filed the first property transfer. Either Amara had been monitoring something that made her begin to prepare before the affair even started, or someone in the organization had known what was being planned and had told her, or both. The elevator reached the lobby. Dante walked out into the cold night air and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Someone inside the Ravello organization had arranged his affair, had engineered his distraction, had put him in a room with a woman specifically designed to occupy him, to separate his attention from his marriage, from his business, from the woman who had been quietly holding the infrastructure of his empire together. And whoever had done that, whoever had decided that the best way to weaken the Ravello organization was to go through Dante's marriage had either calculated wrong about Amara's response, or had calculated correctly and was waiting for exactly this moment. He pulled out his phone and called Victor. Enzo, he said. Someone using that name, 8 months ago. I need a name behind the name. Victor was quiet for just a moment too long. Victor, I'll make some calls tonight. Not tonight, Dante said. Now. He stood outside the building in the cold and waited. It took Victor 40 minutes. 40 minutes and 3 calls and access to a surveillance log from a camera positioned outside a restaurant on the west side that a member of the Ravello organization had been quietly maintaining for reasons that had nothing to do with the current situation. The man who called himself Enzo at fundraisers that didn't exist was a mid-level associate named Carmine Ruiz. Carmine had been with the organization for 7 years and operated primarily in the space between the casino side and the financial network, meaning he had enough access to know which threads to pull, without being senior enough to attract close scrutiny. Carmine's direct superior was Eddie Corso. Eddie, who had received the Delfino proposal this morning and waited until 7 in the evening to mention it. Eddie, whose expression had been professionally blank in a way that was slightly too deliberate. Dante stood outside the building in the Chicago cold and felt something that was colder than the weather move through him. Not anger, or not only anger. Something more precise than anger. The particular kind of clarity that comes when a pattern that has been forming slowly suddenly arranges itself into a shape you can see all at once. Someone had engineered the affair. Someone had used Bianca to occupy him. Someone had wanted the marriage damaged, had wanted Dante distracted at the exact period when Amara's financial separation from the organization was becoming structurally complete, except that didn't track. He stopped himself. If Eddie had orchestrated the affair to weaken Amara's influence, he would have needed to know about her control of the Valenti assets in the first place. And if Eddie knew about that and had been trying to remove her influence, then why would he direct Dante toward an affair that would make Amara more motivated to withdraw those assets? Not less. Unless Eddie hadn't been trying to weaken Amara. Unless Eddie had been trying to weaken Dante. An organization where the boss is distracted by a collapsing marriage and the legitimate infrastructure is hemorrhaging. That was an organization where a smart lieutenant with the right external relationships could position himself as a stabilizing force. An organization that needed someone to step in and negotiate the crisis. Someone with existing contact with the Delfino family who had received a proposal this morning that he'd sat on for hours. Dante called Victor back. The proposal from the Delfinos, he said. How long has Eddie Corso been in contact with them? Pause this time was longer. Victor, how long? At least 5 months, Victor said. Possibly longer. There's a communication pattern in the financial records that I flagged 3 weeks ago but hadn't fully traced yet because I didn't know what I was looking at. Dante, I should have brought this to you sooner. I'm sorry. I thought it was standard business development until tonight. 5 months. The affair had started 8 months ago. Property transfers had started 8 months ago. And 5 months ago, Eddie Corso had begun building a relationship with the Delfino family. The family that would be perfectly positioned to absorb the Ravello organization's legitimate infrastructure if the organization fractured under the weight of Dante's personal and financial crisis. The picture was complete now. Dante stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. Someone inside his organization, someone he'd trusted, someone who sat in his study and listened to his plans and ate at his table, had decided that Dante Ravello's marriage was the most vulnerable point of entry and had worked it systematically, patiently, over the course of nearly a year, with the goal of sitting in the rubble of the Ravello organization when it was over and offering to help pick up the pieces. The fury that moved through Dante then was different from the kind he usually felt. The kind he usually felt was manageable. It had weight and heat and direction, and he'd spent 20 years learning to aim it where he wanted it to go. This kind was colder. The kind that doesn't need to be aimed because it already knows exactly where it's going. He called Sal. The meeting with Caruso tomorrow morning, he said. Cancel it. Dante, I need you to do something else for me tonight. I need you to find Eddie Corso and make sure he doesn't go anywhere. A pause. Quietly, no drama. Just make sure he stays available. Another pause up from Sal. The kind that meant he understood exactly what available meant in this context. Done, Sal said. Dante put the phone in his pocket and stood in the cold a moment longer. He thought about Amara's voice on the phone the night before. calm and certain. The way she'd laid out exactly what she knew and exactly what she wanted, without tears, without threats, without anything that could be called weakness. The woman he had married at 29, who had sat quietly in the background of his empire for 8 years and let him believe she was there because she had nowhere else to go. She had known. Not just about Bianca, about everything. About the organization's dependency on her assets. About the timeline. About the fact that the ground was going to fall away eventually. She had prepared, and while she was preparing, while she was quietly and methodically separating her legally held assets from an organization built partly on her inherent summune, hence, someone inside that organization had been trying to use Dante's distraction to position themselves to take over what was left. They had all been moving pieces on the same board, and none of them had known what the others were doing, and now it was all landing in the same week, and the center of it was Dante, who had believed he was the one controlling the game. He had never been in control of this. The understanding of that, the full, undefended weight of it settled into Dante Ravello's chest on a cold Chicago sidewalk, with no one watching, no one to perform composure for, no audience to be strong in front of. And for a moment he simply stood there under the knee. He stood there under the cold Chicago sky and let the weight of it land without flinching away from it. That was the thing about Dante Ravello that even his enemies had to respect, privately, in the moments after they'd already lost to him. He didn't flinch. Not from bad news, not from pain, not from the particular humiliation of being wrong, in ways that couldn't be undone. He absorbed it. Let it move through him completely, like a man standing in a current and feeling it push against every part of his body at once. And then he got his feet under him, and he figured out his next move. Stood on that sidewalk for 90 seconds. Then he got in the car. The driver said nothing. He'd been with Dante for 6 years and had learned early that silence was a form of service. He pulled into traffic and drove without being told where, falling into the route back to the mansion automatically. And Dante sat in the back and stared at the passing streetlights and did what he'd always been best at when everything else was failing him. He thought. Eddie Corso had been with the Ravello organization for 11 years. He had come in through the casino side, recommended by a contact in Atlantic City, vouched for by 2 separate sources that Dante now needed to re-examine entirely. He was meticulous, financially fluent, and had the kind of loyalty that had always registered as genuine, because Eddie's self-interest had always aligned with the organization's prosperity. That was the most durable kind of loyalty in Dante's world, not the sentimental kind, not the kind built on fear, but the pragmatic kind that held as long as the incentives held. The incentives had apparently shifted. Somewhere in the last year, Eddie Corso had looked at Dante Ravello and made a calculation. He'd looked at the marriage, looked at the financial structure underneath the empire, and decided that a controlled implosion served him better than continued loyalty to a boss who didn't know how exposed he actually was. And he'd been almost right. That was the part that sat in Dante's chest, like a piece of metal. Almost. He called Victor again from the car. "Everything I'm about to ask you, I need answered before morning," he said. "The Atlantic City contact who vouched for Eddie 11 years ago. I need to know his current relationship with the Delfino family. I need to know when that relationship started. I need the communication records between Eddie and Carmine Ruiz going back 18 months. And I need to know where the Delfino proposal is, sitting right now. Whether it's a formal document, whether it's been signed anywhere, whether any other member of this organization has seen it." Victor was writing. Dante could hear the pen. "Give me 4 hours. You have 3. He hung up and looked out the window at Chicago, sliding past in the dark, the lit windows of apartment buildings, the orange wash of street lights on wet asphalt, the lake somewhere to the east, making the air heavier than it should be for a November night. He thought about Amara again. He kept coming back to her, the way you keep running your tongue over a broken tooth, involuntarily, with a specific kind of pain that you can't stop triggering. 8 months ago, she had started moving her assets. The first transfer was filed 8 months ago, which meant she had known, or strongly suspected, 8 months ago. And Carmine Ruiz had introduced Bianca into Dante's orbit 8 months ago. The 2 timelines were identical, which meant either Amara had seen something that same month that had triggered both her own preparations and the scheme that was already being set in motion against her, or someone had told her. Someone had told Amara what was coming before it arrived. Dante leaned forward. "Take me back to the mansion," he said. Fast. He was in the study when Sal called at midnight. "Eddie's home," Sal said. "Two of mine are outside the building. He's not going anywhere." "Good. Don't move on him yet. I need one more thing confirmed first." "What thing?" "Carmine Ruiz," Dante said. "Where does he live?" Sal gave him an address in Bridgeport. A two-flat on a street Dante knew, modest. The kind of neighborhood where a mid-level associate kept a low profile, because keeping a low profile was part of the job. "I'm going there tonight," Dante said. Sal was quiet for a moment. "You want company?" "No." Dante? "No, Sal." He drove to Bridgeport himself, which he hadn't driven himself somewhere without a security detail in roughly 4 years. Car was a plain dark sedan from the second garage, nothing identifiable, and he sat behind the wheel in the unfamiliar position of being the one navigated, instead of the one being navigated, which felt strange in a way he hadn't expected. Carmine Ruiz's building was dark when he arrived. One light on the second floor, behind a curtain. Dante sat outside for 7 minutes. Then he went in. He didn't knock. The door wasn't particularly solid, and Dante had learned to open doors like this one when he was 19 years old, from a man who'd since died of natural causes in a prison in Ohio, and the skill hadn't left him. He was inside and up the stairs before Carmine had processed the sound of entry, and he was in the doorway of the second-floor bedroom before Carmine, who had been sitting up in bed, watching something on a laptop, fully understood what he was seeing. Carmine was 41, lean, with the kind of face that had always been forgettable by design. He went pale, the way people go pale when the blood actually leaves the surface, not a performance of fear, but the involuntary hydraulics of a body that has just decided all available resources need to go somewhere more central. Dante crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside the bed, with the particular unhurried quality that had always frightened people more than if he'd arrived loud and aggressive. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at Carmine. "Enzo," he said. Carmine's jaw worked. Nothing came out. "I already know most of it," Dante said. "I don't need you to fill in every blank. I need you to tell me one specific thing, and if you tell me truthfully, tonight ends differently for you than it does if you don't." He waited. "Did Eddie Corso instruct you to make contact with Bianca Moretti, or did you take that initiative yourself?" The silence stretched about 4 seconds longer than it needed to. "Eddie," Carmine said. "When?" "Last spring, March. He gave me her name and her number and told me to set up an introduction. Said he wanted someone in your personal life who wasn't connected to the organization. Someone who could—" He stopped. "Keep going." "Someone who could occupy your attention," Carmine said. Those were the words he used. Occupy your attention. Dante absorbed that. "And did Eddie give you any indication of why he wanted your attention occupied at that particular time?" Carmine looked at his hands. "He said there were changes coming in the organization. He said the structure was going to shift. He said men who had positioned themselves correctly were going to end up on the right side of those changes, and men who hadn't—" He didn't finish that sentence. "He recruited you," Dante said to his side. He made it sound like, "He recruited you," Dante repeated, flat, not angry, just establishing fact. "And you said yes." Carmine looked up. "I have a daughter, Dante. She's 11. I've been putting money away for her since she was born. Eddie told me that what was coming was going to happen regardless of what I did, that the only choice I had was which side I was standing on when it was done." He paused. I believed him. "Okay," Dante said. "Okay? I'm not here to punish you tonight, Carmine." Dante stood up from the chair. "I'm here because I needed that specific piece of information, and now I have it." He moved toward the door. "You're going to stay in this apartment. You're not going to call anyone. You're not going to contact Eddie or anyone associated with him. And in the morning, you're going to come to the mansion, and you're going to tell Victor everything you just told me, and some things you haven't told me yet, in detail." He stopped in the doorway. "If you're in this apartment in the morning, things go one way. If you're not," he let it sit there. "You said you have a daughter." "Yes." "Then be here in the morning." He left. Victor called at 3:40 in the morning. "The Atlantic City contact," Victor said. His voice had the exhausted precision of a man who had been making calls for 3 hours and had found something he wished he hadn't. "His name is Sal DiCarlo. He's been connected to the Delfino family for at least 8 years. Credits Eddie's introduction to us by 3 years. So DiCarlo placed Eddie with us deliberately. That's the only conclusion I can reach. Dante sat with that. 11 years, he said. Eddie Corso has been inside this organization for 11 years. Yes. And for 11 years, he's been… I don't know if he was always working against us, Victor said carefully. It's possible he came in without a specific agenda, and the relationship with Delfino evolved later. It's also possible, he paused. It's also possible he was placed here with a long-term purpose and was waiting for the right moment. The right moment being when the organization's financial structure was vulnerable, which he could only achieve by first knowing the structure existed. Victor's voice shifted slightly. Dante, Eddie has been handling the casino financial network for 6 years. He has visibility into our accounting in ways that I don't think either of us fully mapped. Dante closed his eyes. How much visibility? Enough that if he shared what he knows with the Delfino family, or with law enforcement contacts the Delfinos maintain, the exposure would be significant. It would be catastrophic, Victor said. I want to be precise about this. Catastrophic. The word sat in the room like something physical. Dante opened his eyes. Is there any indication he's already shared it? Not yet. But Dante, if he senses that we know about him, and he decides to move preemptively, he won't sense it until I'm ready for him to. How long do you need? 24 hours. That's not much time to. 24 hours, Victor. He hung up. He looked at the ceiling for a while. 24 hours to dismantle something that had apparently been building for 11 years. 24 hours to separate what Eddie knew from what Eddie could still do with what he knew. 24 hours to address Amara's demand about the captain's meeting, which he had been treating as a separate problem, but was now clearly connected to everything else. Because if the organization was going to fracture under the combined pressure of the financial exposure and the Delfino positioning, the only countermove was to consolidate his own people before Eddie could peel them away. And the only way to consolidate his people, the only play left that actually addressed all of it at once, was the thing Amara had asked for. The truth. Standing in front of his captains and telling the truth. He had been treating her demand as a humiliation, a punishment, a wife's revenge dressed up as a business condition. But sitting in the study at 4 in the morning, with the full picture finally assembled in front of him, he understood something that's changed its shape entirely. Amara's demand wasn't punishment. It was a lifeline. If he stood in front of those men and revealed the truth about the financial structure, about her role, about his failures, he would be doing the one thing Eddie Corso's entire scheme depended on him not doing. Eddie needed Dante to stay silent. He needed Dante's pride to do the work of keeping the truth buried, because an organization where the boss's financial dependency on his wife's assets remained. The secret was an organization that Eddie could fracture by quietly revealing that secret himself on his own timeline to maximum effect. But if Dante said it first, if he stood in that room and said it himself, without being forced, without it being exposed by an enemy, it changed what the truth meant. It became something he chose, rather than something that was done to him. He sat with this understanding until 5 in the morning. Then he picked up the phone and called the one number he hadn't called yet. It rang 4 times. It's early, Amara said. Not groggy. She hadn't been sleeping either. I know, he said. I need to tell you something, Dante. Not an apology, he said. Not yet. I know you're not ready for that. And I know I don't have the right to ask you to be. I need to tell you something factual. He paused. There was a man inside my organization who arranged for me to meet Bianca. It wasn't accidental. He engineered it. He manufactured the affair because he wanted me distracted while he built a back channel to a rival family. Silence on the other end. I'm not telling you this to excuse anything, he continued. What I did, I chose to do. Someone arranged for the opportunity to be there, but I walked through the door myself. I know that. He stopped. I'm telling you because I think you might have known something was happening 8 months ago. I think that might be part of why you started moving the assets when you did. And I need to know if someone told you, if someone inside my organization came to you. No one came to me, Amara said. Then how I noticed, she said simply. I noticed the account charges. I noticed the change in how you were. I noticed the specific way you started lying, which was different from the general way you'd always kept things from me, because this time you were working harder at it. A pause. Women notice when their husbands start working harder at their lies. Dante. Not complicated. He was quiet. Handle your organization, she said. Deal with whatever this man has done. And then when that's done, you still owe me the other thing. That hasn't changed. The line went dead. He set the phone down. Outside, the first gray light of morning was starting to show at the edges of the dark. He slept for 2 hours. Not because he felt safe enough to sleep, but because his body simply stopped cooperating with his intention to remain awake, and he dropped off in the desk chair and woke up with his neck aching and a thin, pale winter daylight filling the study windows. Victor was already there when he opened his eyes. Sitting across the desk, there was coffee on the corner of the desk, which meant Victor had been there long enough to go to the kitchen and come back, which meant he'd been watching Dante sleep, which under any other circumstances would have been strange, but which now simply felt like was an old man keeping watch. Carmine came in at 7, Victor said. He's in the kitchen with Sal. Sal gets the full statement before anyone else hears it. Dante straightened up in the chair and reached for the coffee. Everything Carmine has. Every communication. Every instruction from Eddie. Every timeline. Written. Signed, all of it. Already started. And Eddie? Still at home. Sal's man says he left his building at 6:30, got coffee at the place on the corner, went back inside. Acting normally. Victor watched Dante drink the coffee. He doesn't know we know, not yet. Dante set the cup down. I want to see him tonight. Here, just him and me. Victor was quiet. I'm not going to do anything permanent to him, Dante said, which was the specific phrasing in their world for a specific set of actions, and Victor understood what it meant and what it didn't mean. He has the financial records, Victor said. If he feels cornered, he's not going to feel cornered. He's going to feel confident. He's going to feel like he's walking into a room with a man who doesn't know what he knows. Dante looked at Victor. Can you make that look convincing from outside? I can make the meeting look routine. Dante, what do you want out of this conversation specifically? I want to know what he's already shared with the Delfinos, and whether any of it has moved beyond their internal knowledge. He paused, and I want to hear him say it, in his own words. I want to sit across from him and hear the shape of 11 years of it. Victor looked at him for a moment with an expression that might have been something close to pity, though neither of them would have called it that. All right, Victor said. Eddie Corso arrived at the mansion at 7:30 that evening. He came in the way he always came in, through the side entrance that the inner circle used, past the security's desk without being stopped, because his face was known and his clearance was standard, and nothing about his arrival signaled anything other than a routine evening meeting with the boss. He was wearing a dark gray suit, no tie. He had a leather messenger bag over one shoulder. He looked like a man who had been managing a complicated workday and was now coming in for a briefing. He did not look like a man who was walking into a trap. That was the thing about Eddie Corso. He was very good. Dante was standing at the window when Eddie came in. He didn't turn around immediately. He let Eddie cross the room and take the chair across from the desk, the same chair Eddie had been sitting in for years during hundreds of meetings, and he let a moment pass before he turned. Thanks for coming in, Dante said. Of course. Eddie settled the messenger bag beside the chair. You wanted to go over the Pittsburgh situation? Among other things. Dante moved to the desk and sat down. He put a single folder on the desk between them. I wanted to start with something else first. Eddie looked at the folder. He didn't open it. Sure. The Delfino proposal, Dante said. Tell me more about it. Something moved through Eddie's eyes. Very small. Very fast. The kind of thing most people would have missed. Like I said last night, they reached out through, not the version from last night, Dante said. The real version. The one that starts 8 months ago. The room was very quiet. Eddie looked at the folder. Then he looked at Dante. And Dante watched the calculation happen. In real time, watched Eddie assess the room, the situation. How much Dante might know versus how much Dante might be guessing. How much was provable versus how much was inference. He watched a very intelligent man decide in approximately 3 seconds that Dante knew enough. I don't know what you think. Eddie started. Carmine Ruiz came in this morning, Dante said. Eddie stopped. Written statement. Signed. Witnessed by Victor and Sal. Dante opened the folder and turned it around, so Eddie could see the first page. He was thorough. I'll give him that. Dates, names, specific conversations. He remembered things I wouldn't have expected him to remember. He tapped the page. Like the conversation in March of last year, where you told him The structure of the organization was going to change, and that men who positioned themselves correctly would end up on the right side of it. Eddie looked at the page for a long moment. When he looked up, something had shifted in his face. The professionalism was still there, but underneath it, something else had surfaced. Not fear exactly. Something more like relief of the exhausted kind that belongs to a person who has been maintaining a performance for a very long time and has finally been told they can stop. How long have you known? He asked. Since last night. In the meeting this evening, I needed to hear it from you. Dante leaned back in his chair. 11 years, Eddie. I need to understand 11 years. Eddie looked at the folder. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window behind Dante, where the Chicago night was visible. The city lights scattered across the glass. The Delfino connection started about 4 years ago, he said. His voice had changed quality, less polished, more honest, in the specific way that honesty sounds when it's attracted at through exhaustion rather than choice. Not as I wasn't against you from the beginning. I want you to know that, for whatever it's worth. Tell me when it changed, when I realized what the organization actually was. He paused. Not what it looked like, what it actually was. You had something real here, Dante. You had legitimate infrastructure, real business, real revenue. And I could see from where I sat, with the books in front of me, I could see exactly what was holding it up. He looked up. Her companies, her contracts, her real estate. I knew what Amara's assets represented to this organization long before you did. And I knew that you didn't know. And I knew that she didn't know you didn't know. He stopped. I saw an opportunity to take it, to be positioned correctly when it fractured, Eddie said. I didn't create the vulnerability, Dante. It was already there. The dependency on assets that weren't legally yours, held by a woman who I watched your marriage. I watched it for years. I thought, he paused. I thought it would fracture on its own. And when it didn't, you helped it along. I moved the timeline, Eddie said carefully. Dante looked at him for a long moment. How much does the Delfino family know? He asked. Specifically, what have you given them? Financial summaries, revenue structures, the licensing arrangements. Nothing that constitutes nothing directly actionable from a law enforcement perspective. I kept it at the structural level. Do they have anything in writing from you? Emails, coded but legible if you know the context. What do they want in exchange? A seat at the table, Eddie said. Not to take over, to have a stake. The corridor routes, primarily, and a management role in the legitimate freight side. He paused. Dante, what they're proposing isn't destruction, it's a partnership. Under different leadership. Under you. A small silence. Under someone they could work with, Eddie said. Dante nodded slowly. He looked at the folder. He looked at Eddie. And then he said the thing that Eddie had clearly not expected. I'm going to give you the chance to fix this. Eddie stared at him. Not because I've forgiven it, Dante said. Not because what you did is something that gets forgiven in this world. And I think you know that. But because the alternative, going to war with the Delfinos, from a position of weakness, with my legitimate infrastructure compromised and my organization already fractured, that ends this entirely. And an ended Ravello organization helps no one in this room. He put his hands flat on the desk. You're going to contact your Delfino connection, and you're going to tell them the partnership proposal has changed. New terms. A legitimate freight consortium with Valenti Global Logistics as the senior partner. Amara's company. Public above board, insulated from the criminal side entirely. He paused. The Delfinos get their seat at the table, in a legitimate business, with no criminal exposure. Eddie was very still. If they accept that, Dante continued, then the Ravello organization retains its structure. The freight corridor stays intact. And he looked at Eddie with an expression that was not warm, but was remarkably not violent. You leave the organization. Clean, no noise. You walk away from this life with whatever you've saved and you don't look back. And if they don't accept it, then we find out what happens when I go to the captain's meeting with everything Carmine gave me this morning and make the case that the Delfino family attempted to infiltrate and destabilize the Ravello organization through a planted associate. Dante watched Eddie's face, which is true, and which will require a response from every family that values the integrity of their own operations. The room was silent for a long time. Eddie looked at the folder on the desk. At 11 years of work. at the carefully constructed position he'd built and the precise moment when it had come apart. The Delfinos won't like the new terms, he said. Then you'll need to be persuasive, Dante said. You're good at that. I've watched you for 11 years. Eddie picked up his messenger bag from beside the chair. He set it on the desk. He unzipped it and removed a hard drive, a bound folder of documents, and a USB stick, and he set all three on the desk in front of Dante. Everything that went to the Delfinos, he said. Copies. The originals are on their end, but at least you'll know exactly what they have. Dante looked at the items on the desk. Make the call, Dante said. Tonight. Eddie nodded once. He stood up from the chair. He was almost at the door when Dante spoke again. Eddie. He stopped. The thing about loyalty, Dante said, is that I always thought it was the most important thing in this world. The thing everything else stood on. He looked at the hard drive on the desk. I'm starting to think I was wrong about what loyalty actually requires. Of the person giving it, and of the person receiving it. Eddie didn't respond to that. He left. Dante sat alone in the study, with the hard drive and the documents and the USB stick spread on the desk in front of him, and he picked up his phone and called the number he'd been avoiding for 2 days. Amara answered on the second ring. The meeting, Dante said. The one with the captains. Set it up. Tell me when and where. Pause. Are you sure, she said. No, he said. And that was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in longer than he could remember. But I'm going to do it anyway. The silence on the line had a different quality than the silences that had come before it, not the silence of a woman who was done talking, but the silence of a woman absorbing something she hadn't been certain she would hear. I'll make the arrangements, she said. Amara. Yes. The baby, he said. His voice caught on something unexpected, caught and held for just a moment before he could move past it. Is he all right? The pause was very small. He's moving a lot, she said. He's fine. She hung up. Dante sat holding the phone and looking at nothing in particular and feeling, beneath all of it, beneath the exposure and the betrayal and the fractured empire and the hard drive, full of evidence of 11 years of someone else's patient ambition, something that had no business being there, something that felt against everything, like the very first thin edge of a way through. He was going to have to stand in front of every man who feared him and tell them the truth about the ground his empire stood on and what he had done to the woman who controlled it. He was going to have to do the one thing that his entire identity had been built to never require of him. And he was going to have to do it, not because it would save his reputation, not because it would preserve the legend of Dante Ravello, but because it was the only thing left that. The night after Eddie left, Dante didn't sleep again. He sat with the hard drive in his hands for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over something you found in the wreckage of your own house, trying to understand how it got there, what it means that it was there, what you're supposed to do with it now that you're holding it. 11 years. He kept coming back to that number. 11 years of Eddie Corso sitting across that desk, attending those meetings, flying with him to negotiations in other cities, standing at the back of the room at Dante's father's funeral with an appropriate expression of grief. 11 years of proximity so close it should have been impossible to maintain a deception that large. And yet, the thing that kept Dante awake wasn't the betrayal. He'd been betrayed before. You didn't build what he'd built without collecting betrayals along the way. They were the tuition you paid for the education of knowing who people actually were when the incentives shifted. He knew how betrayal worked. He knew its shape and its weight, and the particular way it landed differently, depending on how close the person had been. What kept him awake was simpler and more uncomfortable than that. Eddie had been watching the organization for 4 years, had sat with the financial architecture in front of him, had traced every revenue stream and every legitimate front and every corporate structure, and had seen clearly, from the outside, something that Dante, who had built the whole thing, had never once stopped to examine. The dependency. His entire legitimate infrastructure, the thing that made everything else possible, the thing that kept law enforcement from having the kind of clean look at his operation that would have ended him years ago, had been standing on a foundation that wasn't his. And he hadn't known because he hadn't looked. He hadn't looked because he hadn't thought he needed to. He hadn't thought he needed to. Because the person holding it up was his wife. And the wife was in the architecture of his thinking, in the deep structural assumption he'd never bothered to examine simply part of the background, part of the house, present and permanent. and not requiring analysis. He had treated the most important financial relationship in his organization the way you treat a wall. You don't think about the wall. You put things against the wall. You hang things on the wall, and you never think about what holds the wall up, because you've never had reason to imagine it not being there. He set the hard drive down at 4 in the morning and looked at the ceiling and tried to locate, somewhere inside himself, the version of Dante Ravello that would have walked away from this, would have looked at all of it, the exposure, the betrayal, the captain's meeting Amara had demanded, and simply chosen to cut losses. Transfer what could be transferred. Let the rest dissolve. Walk away from the empire and build something smaller and cleaner, somewhere else, the way men in his world sometimes did when the weight of what they'd built became greater than what they could carry. He couldn't find that version. Not because the empire was worth it. He was no longer entirely sure the empire had been worth the price he'd paid for it, but because walking away now would mean that every choice he'd made, every compromise, every betrayal of the man he might have been before he became. This one would have purchased nothing, would have cost him his wife, his son's childhood, his integrity, and his organization, and left him with exactly the diminished version of himself that he'd always been running from. He was going to the meeting. He was going to stand in front of those men and say what needed to be said, not for the empire, for the only thing that had ever actually been worth saving in it. The meeting was set for Thursday evening at 8 o'clock. Amara had made the arrangements through Victor, which Dante had agreed to, because using Victor as the intermediary maintained the appearance of organizational coherence, and the boss was calling the meeting, the consigliere was facilitating. Everything was proceeding through proper channels. The location was the Ravello family's private social club on the near west side, a 4-story building that had served as the organization's formal gathering place for over 2 decades. The room where these meetings happened was on the 3rd floor. Long table, high-backed chairs, no windows. The kind of room where decisions were made that the public never heard about. 23 men had been invited, 11 Ravello captains, 4 allied family representatives, 3 senior lieutenants, 2 financial advisors who sat outside the formal hierarchy, but whose presence in that room signified their standing in the organization, and Victor, who would sit at Dante's right hand the way he always did, which was the only thing about Thursday night that was going to feel familiar. Wednesday was preparation. Dante spent Wednesday moving through the organization with a focus and efficiency that surprised people who'd been watching him come apart at the seams for the past week. He met with Marco about the warehouse situation and what a Valenti Delfino freight consortium would mean for their logistics operations in practical terms. He spoke by phone with the Pittsburgh representative and gave them enough of the story to keep them in their seats without giving them the version that would send them running. He met with Sal in the afternoon, and they talked for 2 hours about the captains who was solid, who was uncertain, who might be reachable by the Delfino offer if Eddie had already been working them. 3 names emerged from that conversation. 3 captains who had been behaving differently in the past month, accepting meetings they wouldn't have accepted before, returning certain calls faster than others. Small things, the kind of things that individually meant nothing, but arranged together in a pattern, meant someone was keeping options open. Tommy Caruso is one of them, Sal said. I know. You still want to talk to him before Thursday? Dante thought about it. No. Let him come to the meeting, not knowing what he's walking into. I want to see his face when it starts. Sal nodded, slowly. Dante, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it, as coming from someone who has been with you since before this organization was what it is now. Say it, what you're going to do. Thursday, Sal paused. He was a man who chose his words carefully, not out of calculation, but out of a genuine and old-fashioned belief that words should mean what they said. It's going to cost you something you can't get back. In that room, with those men, the way they see you afterward is not going to be the same as the way they see you now. I know. And you're doing it anyway. Yes. Sal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a simplicity that made it land harder than something elaborate would have. Good. That was all. Dante understood what it meant. Sal wasn't endorsing a strategy. He was recognizing something that had nothing to do with strategy. He was recognizing a man choosing to be a different thing than he'd been, at significant cost in a room full of people for whom that kind of choice registered as weakness. Sal thought it was worth it. Coming from Sal, that meant something. Thursday arrived, the way important days always do, identical to every other day in its first hour. The same gray light through the same windows. The same coffee Victor brought without being asked. The same city noise filtering in from outside. Nothing in the morning announced itself as the day everything changed. It was just morning. Dante ate breakfast, which he hadn't done properly in a week. He showered. He put on the charcoal suit that he wore to meetings where he needed to look like himself, not threatening, not casual, just precisely what he was. He looked at himself in the mirror for longer than usual. He looked older than 37. Not in a way that was terrible. In a way that was honest. His phone rang at 10 in the morning. Unknown number, which meant Amara. "I need to tell you something before tonight," she said. "All right. My water broke this morning." Everything stopped. "Amara, I'm at the hospital. I'm stable. The baby is fine, but they're saying it's going to happen in the next few hours." Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not fear exactly, but the specific kind of contained intensity that belongs to a person in the middle of something their body is doing without asking permission. "I'm not calling to ask you to come. I'm calling because you needed to know." "Which hospital?" "Which hospital, Amara?" Pause. She gave him the name. "I'll be there after the meeting," he said. Another pause. "The meeting matters more than... The meeting is the reason I can look my sons in the face someday," he said. "I'll be there after." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something had shifted slightly in her voice, not warmth, not forgiveness, but something more fundamental than either of those things. Recognition. "Okay," she said. He hung up. He stood in the center of the bedroom and breathed. His son was coming tonight. He had a meeting to get through first. He put his jacket on and went downstairs. They arrived at the club at 7:45. Dante and Victor came in through the back, which was standard. The security on the door knew their faces and said nothing as they passed through the kitchen and up the service stairs to the third floor. The meeting room was already lit. The table was already set water glasses, notebooks, the particular arrangement of chairs that signaled this was formal rather than informal, that whatever was discussed here had organizational standing. Men were filing in. Dante stood at the head of the table and watched them take their seats. He watched Tommy Caruso come in with his captain's careful, the composed face, the measured eye contact, the handshake that lingered half a second longer than necessary, because Tommy was a man who read rooms through physical contact. He watched the three allied family representatives come in together, which was itself a small signal solidarity, or the performance of it. He watched Eddie Corso's empty chair. Eddie wasn't coming. That had been communicated to the attendees as a scheduling conflict. What it actually was, nobody in the room knew yet. When everyone was seated, Dante remained standing. The room settled into the particular silence that a room full of dangerous men settles into when they understand that something is about to happen that hasn't been announced in advance. Not hostile silence, attentive silence. The kind where every person is very still and very aware of every other person. Dante looked at the table. "I'm going to tell you something tonight that I haven't told anyone in this room before," he said. His voice was level, not loud. He'd never needed to be loud to be heard. "And I'm going to ask you to sit with it before you respond, because some of what I'm going to say is going to land hard, and I need you to hear all of it before you react to any of it." Tommy Caruso's eyes shifted very slightly, just to the man beside him and back. It took less than a second. Dante saw it. 14 years ago, Dante said, "When I was putting together the first real structure of this organization, I needed capital." Some of you know that story. Some of you were there for parts of it. What none of you know, what I didn't know until last week, is where that capital actually came from. The room was absolutely still. "It didn't come from the Lacari network," he said. "That's what I believed. That's what I told people. The money was routed through a Palermo account, and I didn't follow it back far enough to find its actual source." He put both hands flat on the table. The $4 million that financed the beginning of this organization came from a private trust established by Emanuele Valenti, an investor whose legitimate logistics empire Yuval benefited from without knowing who built it. That trust was administered by his granddaughter. Paused. "My wife," he said, "Amara Valenti Ravello, who was 22 years old and chose to invest her inheritance in an organization run by a man she believed in without telling him where the money came from. and then spent the next 8 years quietly building the legitimate infrastructure that has protected every one of us from the kind of exposure that ends organizations. He looked around the table, the warehouses, the transportation licenses, the commercial real estate that our business fronts operate from, the financial structures that have kept law enforcement's eyes off our actual revenue. Amara built that with her own money, her own business intelligence, and her own legal expertise, while the rest of us took credit for an organization that was standing partly on a foundation we didn't build. Nobody moved. And while she was doing that, Dante said, and here his voice changed, not broke, but changed. In the way a material changes when it reaches the edge of what it can bear without changing, I was making choices that required her to protect herself from me, from the man she'd backed with her inheritance. She spent the last 8 months separating her legally held assets from this organization, which is within her rights, which is something nobody in this room can challenge, legally or otherwise, because she owns what she owns, free and clear. He looked at Tommy Caruso. Tommy's face was doing something complicated. There's more, Dante said, and this part is why all of you needed to be here in person. He reached into his jacket and placed a document on the table, then another, then a third. Someone inside this organization made a calculation that the situation with Amara represented an opportunity. They began building a relationship with an external family, the Delfinos, with the intention of positioning themselves to take over the legitimate freight infrastructure if this organization fractured under the weight of my personal failures. He tapped the documents. These are communications between that individual and the Delfino family. Dates, terms, the structure of what was being proposed. The individual in question has been separated from this organization as of last night. The allied family representative from Pittsburgh, a compact gray-haired man named Falco, who Dante had dealt with for a decade, leaned forward very slightly. Who, he said. Eddie Corso. The room absorbed that. Falco's expression didn't change much, but the set of his mouth shifted. Eddie Corso had attended meetings with Pittsburgh, had been in rooms with most of these men, had been introduced as a trusted member of the Ravello inner circle. The Delfino proposal, Dante continued, has been replaced with a legitimate freight consortium arrangement. Valenti Global Logistics as the senior partner. Above board, legally clean, insulated from this organization's other operations. The Delfinos get a minority interest in a legitimate business. We retain the corridor routes and the transportation infrastructure. He looked at Falco. Pittsburgh benefits from the stabilized routing as well. I have the term sheet if anyone wants to review it. Falco sat back. He looked at the documents. He looked at Dante. Why are you telling us this? He said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Because you have a right to know what the organization you're affiliated with is actually built on, Dante said. And because some of you have been getting calls from people who have their own version of this story, and I wanted you to hear mine first. Tommy Caruso's jaw tightened. There it was. Tommy, Dante said. Caruso looked at him. His face was the face of a man who has been caught, but is not yet certain of how much has been seen. Yeah. The dinner with the Delfino brothers last week. Beat. It was informal. Was it? We talked about. Tommy. Dante's voice was quiet, not threatening. Just done with the performance. I'm not here tonight to punish anyone. I'm here tonight to tell the truth about this organization, because it's the only move left that doesn't end with all of us losing everything we've built. So I need you to decide, right now, in front of everyone in this room, whether you're in or you're out. Not tomorrow. Now. The room had the quality of a room in which something irreversible is about to be decided. Tommy Caruso sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at Dante Ravello, at this man he had followed for 15 years, had watched become something that other men stepped back from, had watched hold the organization together through law enforcement pressure and rival aggression and internal conflict, and he looked at what Dante had just done, had just stood in a room full of dangerous men and told the truth about his failures and his wife's intelligence and his organization's financial dependency, which was the kind of thing that cost a man in this world everything. Kind of thing that no one in his right mind did unless he decided that the thing he was protecting was more important than the version of himself he was giving up to protect it. Tommy Caruso looked at that. And then he looked at the 3 men from the Delfino meeting who were sitting around the table And he made a decision that Dante could see happening in real time in the small changes of muscle around his eyes and jaw. In, Tommy said. Two of the other uncertain captains said it within 30 seconds of each other, as though Tommy's decision had given them the permission they'd been waiting for. The third, a man named DiPietro, who Dante had always liked less than he'd admitted, pushed back from the table and stood up. I need time to think about this, DiPietro said. Sit down, Anthony, said Sal, from his end of the table. Sit down. Sal's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He was 61 years old and had been in this room longer than DiPietro had been in this business. And the weight of that was in his voice without any addition. The man just told you the truth. The least you can do is stay in your chair long enough to hear all of it. DiPietro sat down. Dante continued. He went through the financial structure, specific properties, the specific contracts, the exact nature of the Valenti assets' relationship to the organization's legitimate operations. He laid it out without softening it, without the kind of framing that would have preserved his image at the expense of clarity. He gave them the full picture, and as he spoke, he watched the faces around the table and read them the way he'd been reading rooms all his life. What he read was not what he'd expected. He'd expected skepticism. He'd expected the specific kind of careful blankness that men in his world wore when they were recalibrating, when the math they'd been running on a situation had just been interrupted by new data, and they needed time to recompute. He'd expected some version of the calculation. Is this man still worth following? Or has he just demonstrated that he can be outmaneuvered in ways that make him a liability? Some of that was there. But underneath it, in more faces than he'd anticipated, was something else. He wasn't certain of the word for it at first. It took him most of the meeting to find it. Respect. Not the fear-adjacent respect that came from power and reputation, and the knowledge that crossing Dante Ravello had historically carried severe consequences. Something quieter and less familiar than that. The kind of respect that a room of hard men can feel for someone who has just done something that hard men generally don't do. Told the truth when it cost him. The meeting ended at 10:15. Men filed out. Handshakes were different than they'd been coming in more solid. Some of them, and in a few cases, accompanied by eye contact. That meant something beyond protocol. Falco from Pittsburgh stopped beside Dante and looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then nodded once. The way you nod at someone you've just decided to recalibrate your assessment of, and left. Pietro left without making eye contact with anyone. Tommy Caruso was the last one out. He stopped at the door. Dante, he said, Tommy, the Delfino dinner. He didn't look away. I was hedging. I want you to know that's all it was. I know, Dante said. I'm sorry. Dante looked at him. Don't be sorry. Just don't do it again. Tommy left. Victor came to stand beside Dante at the head of the empty table. The room smelled like coffee and the faint residue of tension that large gatherings of tense men leave behind. Well, Victor said, yeah, DiPietro is going to be a problem. DiPietro is going to be manageable, Dante said. There's a difference. Victor was quiet for a moment. You should go to the hospital. Dante was already reaching for his jacket. He arrived at Northwestern Memorial at 11 o'clock. The lobby was the particular activated quiet of a hospital, late at night. People moving with purpose, the PA system murmuring. The smell of antiseptic and recycled air. He went to the desk and gave Amara's name and was told to wait, which was not something Dante Ravello was accustomed to being told in any context. He sat down in a chair in the waiting area. He sat there for 40 minutes. He thought about the meeting, about the faces around the table, about Sal saying good with the particular simplicity that meant something more than the word, about Tommy Crusoe's I'm sorry, and what it had felt like to receive it without the reflex toward contempt that such admissions usually triggered in him. He thought about the version of himself that had sat in his car outside this same hospital 8 years ago, before Amara, before the Empire, before all of it, young and certain, and completely mistaken about what strength actually required. A nurse appeared at the door of the waiting area, young, efficient, carrying a small box. She walked toward him with the directness of someone on an errand, not a message. Mr. Ravello? Yes. She held out the box. He opened it. Amara's wedding ring, the 5-carat solitaire he'd bought her, before he knew what he was capable of destroying. Still perfect. Still cold from wherever it had been sitting. Nothing else in the box. No note, no message, no invitation. He held the ring and looked at the door the nurse had come from, and he understood what it meant with the same absolute clarity that you understand a thing when there's no version of it that means anything else. She was telling him something that couldn't be said with words in a hospital waiting room, something that the ring communicated precisely because of everything it had once meant and everything it meant now, returned to him not in anger, but in the quiet finality of a woman who had decided that what she was keeping mattered more than what she was giving back. He was a father. He was on the wrong side of a locked door. And somewhere's the other side of it, Amara Ravello was holding their son. Dante's hands were not shaking. He closed his fingers around the ring and looked at the door and understood, for the first time in his life, that there were some doors that could not be opened by threat or money or reputation or any of the instruments he'd spent his life building. Some doors only opened from the inside. In the waiting room, he sat in the waiting room chair, this man who had controlled rooms full of dangerous people, who had made that altered the course of other people's lives, without breaking a sweat, who had built an empire on a foundation he didn't even know existed, and he waited, not because he had options, because it was the only thing left to do. And in the silence of that waiting room, with the ring still cold in his hand, without any knowledge of what had just ended and what had just begun, Dante Ravello sat. He sat in that waiting room chair until midnight, then until 1 in the morning. The ring stayed in his closed fist the entire time, warm now from his body heat, which felt like a small and meaningless thing to notice, but which he noticed anyway. The waiting room cycled through people around him, a family in the corner whose news had clearly been good, a man in his 50s who paced the length of the room 11 times before sitting down, a young woman who fell asleep in her chair, with her coat pulled up to her chin. Dante sat still through all of it, the way he'd learned to sit still in rooms, where movement would have revealed something he wasn't ready to reveal. At 1:14 in the morning, the door opened. Not the nurse, not a doctor. A man Dante recognized but had not expected. Lorenzo Vescari was 68 years old, built like a man who had once been physically imposing and had settled into a dignity that was more durable than size. He had silver hair cut close, dark eyes that moved through rooms, the way experienced eyes do cataloging, assessing, never landing anywhere without purpose. He wore a charcoal overcoat and no tie, and he walked into the waiting room with the particular unhurried quality of a man who had never in his life needed to rush anywhere because things arranged themselves around his arrival rather than the other way around. He saw Dante. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside him without being invited, which was itself a statement about the nature of what was about to be said. Lorenzo Vescari had known Emanuele Valenti, had done business with him for over 20 years, had been at his funeral, had maintained a relationship with Valenti's family through the years after his death with the particular old-world consistency that men of his generation treated as both obligation and honor. Dante had known of Vescari for years, had been careful around him the way you were careful around a man whose respect you had not earned and whose disapproval carried weight you couldn't afford. He had never sat this close to him before. "Your son was born at 1247, Lorenzo said. His voice was low and even. He spoke the way men speak when they have decided exactly what they want to say before they enter the room. Pounds 3 ounces. He's small, but he's strong. The doctors are satisfied. Dante absorbed that. The tightness in his chest that had been there since Amara's call that morning loosened by exactly 1 degree. 1 degree, no more. And Amara, she's tired, she's well. Lorenzo paused. She asked me to come speak with you. Instead of coming herself. She just gave birth, Dante. Fair point. He said nothing. Lorenzo looked at the waiting room around them, at the institutional chairs, the muted television mounted in the corner, the vending machine humming against the far wall. He looked at it all with the mild curiosity of a man who rarely found himself in ordinary spaces and was not uncomfortable with the strangeness of being in one now. I've known Amara since she was 11 years old, he said. I was at her grandfather's table when she was a child. I watched her grow up after Emanuele died. I watched her make the decision to invest her inheritance in your organization, which I will tell you I advised against, though she was 22 and certain of herself, and didn't require my advice. He turned and looked at Dante directly. I also watched what happened to her in this marriage. Not the details, but enough. Dante held the ring tighter. She has asked me to serve as a guarantor, Lorenzo said, for the trust arrangement. Her companies, her assets, structured into an independent vehicle for herself and the child. I've agreed. What that means practically is that no affiliated family, no organization with any relationship to mine, and no one with any interest in maintaining a functional relationship with my network will interfere with Amara or the boy. He paused. Ever. I understand, Dante said. Do you? You're telling me that if I move against her, in any way financially, legally, personally, I am starting a conflict I cannot win and cannot afford. I'm telling you, Lorenzo said, that she has earned protection she should never have needed, and I am making certain she has it. He was quiet for a moment. I'm also telling you something else. Something she didn't ask me to say. Dante looked at him. At the meeting tonight, Lorenzo said. What you did. Dante went still. You have people in that room. I have people everywhere, Dante. That's not the point. Lorenzo leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands loosely folded, an unexpectedly unguarded posture for a man of his bearing. Point is that what you did tonight is not something most men in your position would have done. And I want you to understand that I am aware of it, and that it changes certain things about how I see what has happened here. It doesn't change what I did to her. No, Lorenzo's agreed. It doesn't. But it changes what you did tonight. And sometimes that matters. He stood up, straightening his overcoat with the small, precise movements of a man who had maintained his appearance through decades of difficult situations. You won't be allowed to see her tonight, or tomorrow. She needs time that I think you understand she has earned. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small envelope, which he set on the chair beside Dante. She left this for you. He walked out of the waiting room without looking back, which was the only way Lorenzo Vescari ever left rooms. Dante looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he opened it. Inside was a photograph, a Polaroid, slightly blurred the way Polaroids sometimes are, taken from the side, in the low warm light of what was clearly a hospital room. Amara's arm, bare and tired, extended across white sheets, and curled against her, impossibly small, dark-haired, one hand fisted against his own cheek in the specific defiant gesture of a newborn who has just arrived and is already done being told what to do. Nico. Dante sat with the photograph for a long time. He didn't notice when the waiting room emptied around him. He didn't notice the shift change at the nurse's station, or the light beginning to change outside the high windows, or the gradual increase in noise that signals the end of a hospital's quiet hours. He sat with his son's photograph in one hand, and his son's mother's ring in the other, and he felt, moving through him in slow and terrible waves, the full accumulated weight of every choice he had made in the last year. Not guilt, exactly. Or not only guilt. Something more complete than guilt, which is just the recognition that you did something wrong. This was the recognition of what the wrong thing had cost. Specific. Itemized. Amara's face on their wedding day. Particular way she used to fall asleep on the couch, with a book open on her chest, already gone under before she'd finished the page. And the way he'd found her like that on evenings when he came home earlier than expected and had felt, briefly and without examining it, something very close to the feeling of having a home. The nursery she'd built with her own hands, the blankets folded in stacks by size, the mobile with the painted stars. The $4 million she had invested at 22 in a man she believed in, without telling him, without asking for credit, the way you invest in something you love, rather than something you're calculating a return on. All of it was gone now, in the form it had been in. What remained was the boy in the photograph, whose hand was fisted against his cheek, who had his father's stubborn jaw already, and who was going to grow up in a world where Dante Ravello was a name on a document rather than a presence in a house. That understanding, landing completely, and without softening, was the worst thing Dante had ever felt. And he sat with it. He did not flinch from it, did not reach for anger or strategy or any of the instruments he usually used to convert pain into motion. He just sat with it in the waiting room of Northwestern Memorial Hospital while his son slept somewhere on the other side of a locked door, and he let it be as bad as it actually was. He left the hospital at 4 in the morning. The car was where he'd left it. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a while, looking through the windshield at the hospital's entrance. Then he drove home through empty streets, the city stripped down to its bones. At this hour, just the lights and the infrastructure, and the occasional other moving through the dark with its own private destination. Victor was awake when he arrived. Of course he was. Victor had apparently decided at some point in the last several days that sleep was an optional activity, and he was sitting in the kitchen with coffee and a stack of documents that he set aside when Dante came in. He took one look at Dante's face and said nothing about what he saw there. The boy, he asked, healthy. 6 pounds 3. Victor let out a long breath. Good. Dante sat down at the kitchen table. He set Amara's ring and the Polaroid on the table in front of him. Victor looked at both of them without commenting. Vescari was there, Dante said. The trust arrangement. I know about that too. Victor poured a second cup of coffee and pushed it across the table. Dante, there are things we need to address in the next 48 hours. DiPietro's situation. The Delfino response to the new consortium terms. Eddie made contact last night. I got a preliminary reply that's ambiguous but not hostile. Pittsburgh relationship, which I think is actually more stable than it looked a week ago. He paused. But they can wait until morning. The real morning. Several hours from now. No, Dante said. Let's do it now. Victor looked at him. I'm not going to sleep, Dante said. And I need to be doing something. So they worked. At the kitchen table, in the particular gray-edged hours between night and early morning, Dante and Victor went through the organization with the methodical attention of two men rebuilding a structure that had been partially compromised. They addressed each vulnerability in order of urgency. The Delfino response would need a follow-up within 24 hours. Eddie's communication had opened the door, but hadn't closed the deal, and the Delfinos were too experienced to be left waiting long enough to reconsider. Pietro would need to be handled in a way that sent a message without creating a martyr. Dante decided that the cleanest solution was removing his territory's most profitable operations from his oversight, quietly and formally, through a restructuring that could be explained as organizational efficiency. DiPietro would understand what it meant. Everyone would understand what it meant. Nobody would need to have an unpleasant conversation. By 6 in the morning, they had a working plan. By 7, Dante had made 2 calls and sent 1 message. At 7:30, he went upstairs, took off the charcoal suit that had carried the weight of the previous night, and lay down on his bed. He was asleep within 4 minutes. He slept until noon, which was the longest unbroken sleep he'd had in 10 days. When he woke, there was a different quality to the light in the room, the particular flat brightness of a winter Chicago afternoon, and his first coherent thought was about Nico, about the photograph, about the fisted hand and the dark hair and the stubborn tilt of an already stubborn jaw, and the thought arrived not with the freight of everything that surrounded it, but in a form that was almost not quite, but almost uncomplicated. His son existed. Whatever else was true, that was also true. He got up, showered, ate the food that somebody, Victor, probably, or the housekeeper, who had maintained her routine through the chaos of the last week, with the steadiness of someone who understood that maintaining routine was itself a form of service, had left in the kitchen. He ate it at the table, alone, without his phone, without the documents, without the constant low-level noise of the organization that had been his ambient sound for 15 years. Just the kitchen, just the food, just the winter light coming through the window. He thought about what came next. Not in the organizational sense, he had a plan for that, and the plan was in motion. He thought about what came next, in the sense that he had never let himself think about before, the sense of what kind of person he intended to be. Now that the version of himself he'd been had cost him everything that had actually mattered. He didn't arrive at a dramatic conclusion. There was no moment of crystalline certainty. It was more like a gradual acknowledgement of something he'd been circling for days, that the man he needed to become was not a reinvented version of the same thing, not a wiser and more strategic Dante Ravello who made better tactical decisions, but something more fundamental. A man who could sit across a table from his son someday and not need to hide what he was. A man who had earned the right to be in the room, not through power, but through the slower and less photogenic work of becoming someone worth being in the room with. He was 37 years old. He had, he thought, just enough time. 3 weeks later, Amara allowed a supervised visit. The arrangement had been communicated through Lorenzo's office, formatted with the careful legal precision of a woman who was not leaving anything to chance. 1 hour. A neutral location, a private room in a pediatric medical center where Nico had a scheduled checkup. Dante would be present during the checkup itself, as the father, in the medical context. There would be a legal representative present. There would be no discussion of organizational matters, financial arrangements, or the dissolution of the marriage beyond what had already been addressed through attorneys. Those were the terms. Dante agreed to all of them without modification. He arrived 7 minutes early and sat in the waiting area outside the room and did the breathing that he'd never had to consciously do before. The last few weeks, the kind where you focus on some physical mechanism of it, because your mind needs something specific to do while the rest of you waits for something you have no control over. The door opened. Amara came out first. She was thinner than he remembered, which made sense, and there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, which also made sense. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater and dark pants, and her hair was down, and she looked like herself, more like herself, actually, than she'd looked in the last couple of years of their marriage, when he could see now, retroactively, that she'd been carrying something that had made her smaller than she was. She looked at him. There was no anger in it. He'd braced for anger, had decided he would receive it without deflecting if it came. But it wasn't anger. It was something more complicated and less dramatic than anger. It was the look of a woman who has processed something to its conclusion and is now living past the processing, in the territory of what comes after. Dante, she said. Amara. She stepped aside. The nurse who had been holding Nico carried him to the doorway and transferred him into Amara's arms, and Amara crossed the waiting room and held him out. Dante's hands came up automatically, and then Nico was in his arms. 3 weeks old. 6 pounds when he was born, probably closer to 7 now. Still impossibly small by any reasonable human standard, but warm in the specific concentrated way of newborns. Warm like something that is generating its own heat from some internal source you can't see. His eyes were closed. He had the dark lashes that ran in Dante's family, and the jaw and the fist still fisted, still pressing against his own cheek the way it had been in the photograph. Dante stood very still. He was afraid, in the specific way you are afraid of things that are irreplaceable, of dropping him, of holding him wrong, of the 1,000 ways you can damage something small without meaning to. He stood with his son in his arms and did not move and breathed through his nose and looked at this person who had his jaw on his mother's forehead and who had done absolutely nothing yet except exist and breathe and fist his hand against his cheek, and who was nonetheless the most real thing Dante had held in a very long time. He eats constantly, Amara said. Her voice had shifted slightly. Not warm, not distant. Something between the two. The specific register of two people who share something enormous and are trying to figure out how to be in the same room with it. And he hates being put down. We've been doing a lot of not putting him down. Dante started. Stopped. Started again. That sounds like him. You've met him for 30 seconds. He has my jaw. Something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. He does, she said. They stood in the waiting room with the baby between them, and the legal representative sat in the corner reading something on her phone, and the nurse hovered at a professional distance, and Dante held his son for 53 minutes and didn't waste any of them on anything except being present in them. When the hour was up, he handed Nico back to Amara with the same careful attention he'd taken receiving him. He made sure the transfer was solid. He made sure Nico's head was supported. He made sure Amara had him securely before he let go. Then he took a step back. Thank you, he said. Amara looked at him. You don't need to thank me. He's your son. I know. I'm thanking you anyway. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, reading something, the way she'd always been better at reading him than he'd known. Whatever she found there, she kept to herself. She turned and carried Nico back toward the room. At the door, she stopped. Dante. He looked up. I have no interest in keeping him from knowing who you are, she said. Not warmly, not coldly. Just the statement of a woman who has decided what she believes and is communicating it without ornamentation. But who you are is going to matter. What you do from here, the kind of man you actually become. She paused. Not for me. I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm past that. She looked at him steadily. For him. Do it, so that when he's old enough to understand what his parents' lives were, he can see his father shot some worth choosing when it wasn't easy. She went back inside. The door closed. Dante stood in the waiting room with his hands at his sides and the ghost of his son's warmth still in his arms, and he did not move for a long moment. Then he walked out. The DiPietro situation resolved itself within the month, not through conflict, but through the quiet mechanics of reduced authority. A man with less territory and less influence tends to find his options correspondingly limited, and DiPietro was practical enough to understand when the math had changed. He remained in the organization in a diminished capacity and never caused the problem Victor had anticipated, which Victor attributed to the meeting, to the public act of Dante standing in that room and telling the truth, which had apparently shifted something in the organizational calculus that worked in ways Dante was still learning to trace. The Delfino Consortium agreement was finalized 6 weeks after Eddie's removal. Valenti Global Logistics, under Amara's direction, became the senior managing partner of a freight consortium that included Delfino interests and several of the Ravello organization's legitimate transportation assets. On paper, it was a routine business arrangement. In practice, it was the settlement of a conflict that could have destroyed 3 separate organizations, accomplished through a legal structure that cost nobody a war. Eddie Corso left Chicago entirely. He was in Phoenix by the end of the month, which Dante knew because Victor kept tabs on him, and because knowing where a man like Eddie was at any given time was a form of organizational hygiene. He ran a small accounting firm. He was unremarkable in every visible way. Dante neither pursued him nor forgot him, which was its own kind of sentence. Carmine Ruiz kept his apartment in Bridgeport. His daughter, who was 11, started a new school in January. Dante knew this because Sal mentioned it in passing, and Dante filed it away without comment. The organization contracted, not catastrophically, not the public implosion that Eddie had been positioning to benefit from, but measurably. Some territory was absorbed by rivals, not through force, but through the natural drift of organizations that have lost momentum. Some revenue streams dried up when the legitimate infrastructure was formally separated into Amara's independent trust. The Ravello name retained weight, but it was a different kind of weight than before. Less fear, something that Dante was still learning the name for. He thought sometimes it might be credibility, which was different from reputation, which lasted longer. 5 years passed. They passed the way years do when you stop measuring them by the things you're building and start measuring them by the things you're trying to become unevenly, with periods of slowness that felt like stagnation and periods of compressed change that you only understood retroactively. The Ravello organization became, over those 5 years, something smaller and cleaner. Dante divested from operations he could no longer defend with the financial infrastructure he'd lost. He retained the casinos, restructured through legal partnerships that were not entirely clean, but were considerably cleaner than before. He kept the network of relationships that had been built over 15 years, because relationships were not assets that could be transferred through legal documents and were the one thing that had survived intact. He lost territory, revenue, and the specific kind of authority that comes from being unambiguously the most dangerous option in the room. He gained, slowly and without announcement, something else. The ability to sleep, the ability to eat breakfast without a phone in his hand, the ability to sit in a room without cataloging the exits and the vulnerabilities and the angles of approach. Small things, domestic things, things that men who had never lived the way he'd lived would have found unremarkable. For Dante, they were the daily evidence of a transformation that had no clean beginning and just the ongoing work of becoming a person who could be trusted with the things that actually mattered. He saw Nico on a schedule that had been established through attorneys and had gradually, over time, become something more flexible, not warm, not the version of family he'd once imagined when he stood in the nursery before everything broke, but real. Specifically real. Saturday mornings in the early years, when Nico was small enough to sleep through most of the visit, and Dante sat across from Amara's chosen representative and held his son and said very little and learned the specific weight of him and the specific smell of his hair and the specific Way he startled at sudden noises, and then looked around with an expression of affront that was so exactly his father's expression that Dante had to look at the wall. As Nico grew, the visits changed. By 3, Nico was a physical creature of enormous energy and strong opinions about which toys belonged to him, and very little interest in sitting still. By 4, he could say Dante's name clearly, and did so with the casual authority of a child who has learned that names are a form of command. He didn't call him Dad. Amara hadn't encouraged it, and Dante hadn't asked for it. There was time for that word, or there wasn't, and pushing for it would have been the wrong kind of move for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with what the word actually meant. He was building toward it. The charity gala was in December, 5 years after Nico was born. Dante went because the organization had a table there, because maintaining visible civic presence was part of the restructured operations strategy, and because Victor had said it would be good for him to be seen in public social some contexts that had nothing to do with the traditional circles he'd spent his life in. Victor had been right about many things in the past 5 years. Dante had gotten into the habit of listening to him more completely than he used to. He arrived at 8 and moved through the room with the particular efficiency of a man who has attended hundreds of events like this one and knows exactly how to be present without being the most present thing in the room. He spoke to several people. He ate something from the past trays that a server offered, which he didn't particularly taste. He checked his watch. Then, across the ballroom, the crowd shifted, and he saw them. Amara entered, holding Nico's hand. She had become, and this was the word that landed in his mind without him choosing it, authoritative. Not in the performed way of someone who has decided to project strength. In the genuine way of a woman who has spent 5 years doing exactly what she said she was going to do, and has found herself, on the other side of it, more fully herself than she had been before. She was wearing midnight blue, no jewelry except a watch, her hair up in a way that showed the line of her neck and shoulders, and she moved through the room with the ease of someone who belongs in it without needing to prove it. Nico was wearing a small dark suit. He walked beside her with the 5-year-old's particular combination of solemnity and barely contained physical energy, holding her hand with one hand and using the other to point at things that caught his interest, the height of the ceiling, a waiter carrying a tall arrangement of glasses, a chandelier that was clearly the most spectacular thing he had seen all year. Dante stood where he was. He did not move toward them. He watched Amara bend down to say something to Nico, who responded with a whole-body gesture of enthusiasm that made her laugh, and the laugh was real, unperformed. The specific laugh of a woman who is actually happy, not a woman who is managing the performance of happiness for the benefit of an audience. He stood across the ballroom, and he watched his son point at a chandelier with the conviction of someone encountering a marvel, and his son's mother laughed at the conviction, and they were whole, the two of them, complete in their own orbit, not shaped around the negative space of him, just themselves a woman who had built something real and a boy who was being raised in it. Dante stood there long enough that Amara eventually felt the weight of being watched and looked up. Their eyes met across the ballroom. He expected something. He wasn't sure what. After 5 years, he was less certain than ever what he expected from the moments that involved her, because she had a consistent habit of being something other than what he'd prepared himself for. She looked at him. She didn't look away, didn't stiffen, didn't arrange her expression into something managed. She just looked at him, the way you look at someone you once shared something enormous with, someone from a chapter that is genuinely closed, not painfully, not with the raw edges that mean something is still unresolved, but with the clean recognition of a thing that happened and shaped you and is now in the past where it belongs. She gave him a small nod, not warm, not cold. The acknowledgement you offer someone you have made your peace with, which is different from someone you have forgiven, which is different again from someone you have forgotten. He had not expected peace. He had not known it was possible until he saw it on her face. He nodded back, and then Nico said something that made her look down, and she looked down, and just before she turned entirely away from him, she did one thing he didn't expect. She said something to Nico, and Nico looked up, and across the ballroom, and across the ballroom his 5-year-old son looked directly at Dante with his father's eyes, and his father's jaw, and his mother's cautious attentiveness. And he lifted one small hand in a wave that was entirely his own. The gesture of a child who has been told who the man across the room is and has decided, with the uncomplicated directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to make things more complicated than they are, to wave at him. Dante's hand came up. He waved back. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Amara took Nico's hand, and they moved deeper into the room, into the crowd, into the golden light of the ballroom. And Dante stood where he was and watched them go. He didn't follow. He understood that the not following was important, that it was, in fact, the most important thing he'd done in 5 years, not the restructured organization, not the decisions he'd made correctly after years of making them wrong, not the truth he'd told in a room full of men who hadn't expected it. This, standing still and letting them move away from him and not reaching after them, because reaching would have been about what he needed, and they had already given him more than he had earned. He stood there until they were gone from his line of sight. Then he set down his glass on the nearest table and walked toward the exit. Outside, snow was falling, not heavily. The light, dry kind of Chicago snow that sips down without drama, the kind that covers everything so gradually that you don't notice it has happened until the world has already changed. His car was at the curb. Just the car and the driver. No detail behind it. No security arrangement of the kind that had once been standard around him everywhere. He stood outside the entrance for a moment and let the snow land on his shoulders and the back of his hands. Thought about the wave. Nico's hand, raised across the ballroom. A small gesture made by a small person who had done nothing yet to earn the complication of the world he'd been born into, who was being raised by a woman with the intelligence and the will to make sure he had a fighting chance of getting through it clean. Dante had built an empire. He had stood in rooms full of dangerous men and held the kind of authority that most people never come close to. He had made decisions that altered the shape of other people's lives. He had been feared and followed and negotiated with and carefully avoided, and everything that a man in his world was supposed to work toward. And the thing that stood out on the other side of all of it, the single thing from the last 5 years that he returned to when he was alone and honest with himself about what any of it had been for, was a 5-year-old boy in a dark suit who had looked across a ballroom and waved. 3 seconds. He'd give the rest of it up for 3 more. He put his coat collar up against the cold and looked out at the street where the snow was settling on the cars and the sidewalk and the bare branches of the trees along the boulevard. And he understood something he had been understanding in pieces for 5 years, and was only now holding complete. He had spent his life believing that power was the thing you needed most, that if you had enough of it, everything else could be managed. Love could be managed. Family could be managed. Loss could be managed. You just needed enough leverage, enough control, enough of the particular currency that made men step back when you entered a room. He had been wrong. Not because power didn't exist or didn't matter. He was too old and had seen too much to believe in that kind of clean simplicity. Power existed, it mattered. The world was not arranged to reward people who simply refused to engage with it. But power was not the ground. He understood that now. He understood it the way you understand things that you've known intellectually for years, but have to live through at full cost before they become genuinely true for you. The ground was the other thing. The thing that Amara had always had, and that he had mistaken for weakness because it didn't look like what he thought strength was supposed to look like. The willingness to be accountable for who you actually were. The courage, when it finally came down to it, to choose the truth over the version of yourself you'd been protecting. She had walked away from his empire and his protection and his money and his name and had built something with her own hands that was more real than anything he'd ever owned. He had spent years trying to understand how she'd done it. He was starting to think the answer was simple. She had always known what she was building it for. He walked to the car. The driver opened the door without being asked, the way he always did, the simple professional competence that was one of the small dignities of Dante's reduced but not negligible life. He got in. The door closed. The snow kept falling outside the window, covering the city in its dull and indifferent way, as the car pulled away from the curb and into the street. The lights of the gala were visible through the rear window for a moment, golden and warm, the kind of warmth that comes through glass and reminds you of something you can't quite name. Then the car turned, and the lights were gone. Dante settled back in the seat and looked forward through the windshield at Chicago, moving past in the dark and the snow. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel like a man who was running something. He felt like a man who was simply going somewhere, without an entourage, without the permanent low-level vigilance of a person who has made too many enemies to ever fully rest, without the armor that he had spent his entire adult life building around himself, because he'd believed it was the only thing standing between him and the world. He was smaller than he'd been. He was still here. His son had waved at him across a ballroom, and Dante had waved back. And in the entire long record of everything he had done in his life, that was the entry he would choose if he were only allowed to keep one. He looked out the window at the falling snow. He breathed. He went home.